Surely the government must have anticipated, this is your point, that they might lose this judgment. They had already lost it in the Court of Appeal, after all. And it does seem a bit strange to me that they were not a bit more prepared to come out immediately with the plan B. I mean, I know Rishi Sunak says, I've got a new treaty coming with Rwanda. I'm going to introduce legislation in the parliament. It still looked pretty chaotic. And, if he's trying to convince people, I'm doing everything I can to stop the boats, above all, what he's got to convey is grip, control. I'm in charge of events. I'm not surprised that I've lost this court judgment. Because, I always think prime ministers must never look like they're not in control of events. And that's why things like the run on a pound, or a bank failure, or a prison riot, they're so damaging for governments. And here it just looks like these people are not in charge. And the one thing you want from your prime minister is someone in charge. So I think it has been damaging, even if they will think, well, at least we're, putting forward plans on immigration which Labour aren't going to be able to match.
I mean, she's not hugely well known in the country, Suella Braverman, and I think it's right that this may have done for her in a sort of Heseltine kind of way, that the aggression of that letter and the divisiveness of it will make her very unpopular in the Conservative Parliamentary Party. She's not got big numbers on her side. The thing which you can definitely say is that if it went to the members, if she could get on the ballot for a Conservative leadership election after the election at the moment, she's pretty well placed. But I guess what Rishi Sunak has decided to do on Monday by sacking her, and we've seen it unfold in these 3 days, is that his biggest enemies, his fiercest critics, are now on his own side as much as on the other side of the House of Commons, the opposition. He's brought forward the big Conservative row about the direction of conservatism to the here and now, rather than trying to maintain unity until a general election. I just wonder, does that work to his advantage? I mean, 3 days on, was the high point of the Sunak premiership about Tuesday at 3 p.m. Reshuffle had gone down well, Cameron was leading the news, it had all gone well, then suddenly the combination of the Braverman letter and the Supreme Court plunges him back into crisis? Or did he know on Monday this was going to happen? And is this a bold and clever strategic move?
Well, I think it's true to say that the Tory civil war has got going again. And it had basically died down after the fall of Liz Truss. Rishi Sunak had been given a pass by the right of the party to establish himself as Prime Minister. Boris Johnson was ejected from Parliament, which helped a lot, or ejected himself from Parliament, I should say. And now that has been reignited, not just from Suella Braverman, but Nadine Dorries and various other characters. But Sunak has A cabinet I think he's more comfortable with. B, he'll feel he's hitting his big economic targets. We're going to come on and talk about that. C, on asylum, I think he would say, okay, fine, it's really difficult. Lots of countries are struggling with mass migration. At least I've got a plan. Where's the opposition plan?
Although he's not going to stop the boats.
Well, of course, that's the big test he set himself. I mean, by the way, his new Home Secretary, who I quite like, I don't know him that well, James Cleverly, but I've always, from a distance, thought handles himself pretty well. I thought he's been quite amusing because he's the guy in charge of this policy, and he has apparently described it as batshit. And he can't really deny he said this. And it's one of those things when you're accused of it, it's such an unusual phrase to use that it kind of rings true. It's not a phrase you'd invent. I had some sympathy for him in that. It's happened to me in the past when, you say something in private and then people ask you in public whether you said it and you don't want to lie, because most politicians don't actually want to lie in a very direct way like that. So I have some sympathy. Anyway, he's now in charge of this policy. I think there's an interesting question for Rishi Sunak, which is when it comes, so he will say, look, okay, it's tough, I lost the judgment, but I've got rid of Suella Braverman. The Cameron appointment has gone well. The inflation target has been hit. And I have got a plan ahead on dealing with the boats that will make a meaningful difference. I think it's all, the big question now is that plan going to work any better than the plan that has just been shot down by the Supreme Court? And I would make this other observation, which is, he needs to stick to a course. I mean, we were talking, in the last couple of podcasts about how at the party conference he said, I'm the big change candidate. Then he brings David Cameron back. He presents himself now as, I'm occupying the centre ground. I'm the sensible, rational, sober Prime Minister. I follow the rule of law. And then a minute later, when a kind of rogue Tory MP gets up and says, we're going to break the law and send asylum seekers to Rwanda anyway, this is the Deputy Party Chairman Lee Anderson, Rishi Sunak refuses to condemn him. So he's got to kind of pick his groove. He's got to pick his course in politics. And that is what leadership's about. You've got to stick with, your position, even if it's difficult.
Look, the cynical view of the Supreme Court judgment is that the one really bad outcome for Rishi Sunak and for James Cleverly is if the Supreme Court had allowed the policy to go ahead, because the truth is it's going to be very hard for them to stop the boats, even with the Rwanda policy. It's a tiny number of people who would be sent there. It's going to be hugely, hugely expensive. And now at least he can say, if he fails to stop the boats, because there's no way he's going to stop the boats this year or into next year now, he can at least blame somebody else. The trouble is, it was simpler to blame the ECHR, to blame the European Convention. Now, because of the scale of that judgment, it's actually about the United Nations, international treaties, domestic law, and I felt, looking at the commentary, the legal commentary today, nobody thinks there is any credible plan which allows him to turn the Rwanda policy round into next year, certainly before the general election. It'd be very unlikely anybody is going to go on a boat, on a plane to Rwanda before polling day. And so he's going to be on the back foot on this policy all the way through. And I don't think that he, David Cameron and James Cleverly are the kind of politicians who are going to want to blame the judges in the way in which Boris Johnson tried to do a couple of years ago. So I personally think 3 days on, this has not ended up being a great week for Rishi Sunak.
The court verdict looks like a defeat for him, and prime ministers don't like to suffer defeats. I would agree with that. But I think there is a bigger policy issue here which would face the Labour Party very quickly if it was in office, which is how are these countries supposed to deal with mass migration in the modern age and people crossing the Channel or Mediterranean on boats. And other countries like Italy, or indeed, the great shining example of this some years ago was Australia, have processed asylum cases offshore. So it will be a challenge for a Labour government as well. And it'll be interesting. Where I hope Sunak doesn't go is down the route of ECHR withdrawal altogether, which has always been there as something that elements of the Tory right support. For me, that would be very bad for the country, personally, speaking personally, and also bad for the Tory party. And the interesting thing about David Cameron's appointment is now the second most senior member of the government, David Cameron, I don't think necessarily will go along with something as extreme as that. He's actually more right-wing than I am on this. He was a Home Office special advisor for Michael Howard. He's always railed against elements of ECHR judgments. But I think the option of going into the general election saying we're going to pull out of the ECHR and throw the challenge to Labour, see whether they agree or not, I think that's basically now off the table because David Cameron is Foreign Secretary.